This is the GDP per capita of the Russian Empire in Soviet borders compared to that of Japan in 1913. This is the same chart more than 75 years later. Almost an ideal natural experiment. Wait, you may say, what about the Russian Revolution, the famines, the Second World War? For sure, they must be the reasons for such a dramatic difference. First of all, not necessarily. And secondly, that's exactly why the video is dubbed How Communism Destroyed Russia. Not some random historical event. They started the civil war, their forced food requisition led to the famines, and it was them who sacrificed everything to expand domestic military industry and build thousands of tanks and planes, while people were dying from hunger, just to get absolutely destroyed by the Germans in the first months of the war, because who could have thought, but just having equipment is not enough to win. This is a three-part series where we will delve deeper into history to support these accusations with evidence and try to understand how communism destroyed Russia and its neighbors. In this chapter, we'll focus on actions the Reds took despite understanding the risk they bore for the nation's future, but they still proceeded, as their rationale was always to fight for the party, not the people. The Tsarist government mobilized more than 15 million men to fight in the Great War, most of them from rural regions. The empire calculated that this rate is sustainable. They will take people from the unproductive small farms and preserve high-yield commercial estates to provide food to the market. They are, however, mistaken. Russian peasants have been historically very risk-averse, so they left industrial agriculture en masse just to provide for their families. As more people resort to subsistence agriculture, the amount of food available for the cities dwindles. The Russian Empire is a traditional monarchy, not a totalitarian state like Soviet Union. They can't force peasants to starve or even stay in highly productive agriculture just to provide for the urban populations. Only in December 1916 did the Tsarist government institute a grain requisition program, but it was not enforced effectively. So when the disaster strikes, it's already too late. The food riots led to the February Revolution of 1917, which toppled the monarchy and established the provisional government in March. Food remains an issue, but now the nation's focus is somewhere else. The new government operates on a single promise. It will establish a constituent assembly, a parliament, which in turn will decide the future of the Russian Republic. Every man and woman older than 20 from every part of the former empire can vote. All political parties, except pro-German ones, are allowed, and the only resolution the assembly can't pass is the restoration of monarchy. It looks like democracy is finally coming to Russia. However, the provisional government is not the only power holder in the country. On February 27th, a Petrograd, or St. Petersburg Council, or Soviet, is formed, consisting mostly of social democratic forces. They are not opposed to the government initially, but in the next 8 months, Famine militant faction takes over the council. This faction is the Bolsheviks. Their leader Lenin doesn't believe in peaceful revolution. Marx predicted that socialism would first gain hold in developed nations, while Russia isn't one. So Lenin concludes that just waiting is not an option in his country. He also suggests that workers would not develop class consciousness on their own, contrary to Marx's theory, so a highly organized and motivated party should lead them. Today we call this vision of an almost military-like organization aimed at the communist revolution the Vanguard Party, and the Bolsheviks were textbook examples of that. They finally take over the council after their Red Guard paramilitaries helped suppress Kornilov's mutiny in September 1917. Let's not forget that the First World War is still a thing, and by October, Germans are already approaching St. Petersburg. Using this as a pretext, the Bolsheviks centralized command of the Red Guards and called for armed resistance against not only Germans, but also the so-called domestic threats. The provisional government responds by shutting down the Bolshevik newspapers, but it was already too late by that point. The Reds spent a whole month preparing for the takeover and launched a coup on October 24th, and the provisional government ceased to exist 2 days later. However, the Germans were still there, and the Constituent Assembly was still to be called, since the idea of it was insanely popular. The Bolsheviks dealt with the first problem by literally ceding everything they could, despite not even representing Russia. The second was, however, harder to solve. The Reds tried to ban every party ideologically righter than classic liberalism, actively agitated and paraded with weapons in regions they controlled to show force, and threatened the voters and representatives of other parties. Despite this, and being the most organized political force with an exceptional propaganda machine and wide use of violence, they managed to get a whopping 24% of the votes, losing to the socialist revolutionaries with 40% for them and more than 64% if we count their allies. This meant that the Bolsheviks could not realize their agenda through the assembly, so they tried to invalidate the first session of it in January, failed miserably, angrily left the parliament and dissolved it with the Red Guards later, when one of the guards said that
"And now his watch is ended.
The watchmen are tired, so the session must end now, never to gather again, as we know a century later. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly practically started the Civil War. This may sound like a very bad joke. A political party literally behaving like a 5-year-old kid, disregarding everything that didn't go as planned as some kind of conspiracy, and preferring to burn the country down rather than admit defeat. I would have cringed about it, but a more appropriate emotion would be sorrow. From 10 to 17 million people died during the Civil War, about 6 to 10% of the population of the former empire. Most of them lost their lives not because of war itself, but because of repressions, either by the Reds or the Whites, with considerable Red advantage. And the Great Famine in the Volga region, which killed about 5 million people. And yet again, this catastrophe was only partly linked to the conflict. The main reason, as with other communist famines, is the communist policy. Remember the Russian Empire food problem we talked about? The provisional government took a carrot approach, increasing the state prices so peasants would boost production with more profits. They, however, faced the same problem. Russian peasants had been serfs for centuries and didn't value money that much, preferring to have their small but guaranteed influx of food from their personal plots. Cultural norms don't change in an instant, especially in a crisis like war. So it was the Reds who found the correct yet terrible answer. If you want to win now, just take the food from the peasants by force. These are regions affected by the 1921 famine. Such little hungers are often caused by droughts and other yield shortcomings the year prior. Every inch of territory affected by the famine was controlled by the Reds as early as December 1990, so there were no evil whites scorching the earth at the time. The main culprit for the deaths of millions was the so-called wartime communist policy. The Green Requisition Program, or продразверстка, is a common name for methods that the imperial, provisional, and Soviet governments employed, but only the Reds used violence as the primary way to achieve their program's goals. Let's make it straight. Most of the casualties are not because they just take grain from the people, but because the overall output of the nation's agriculture decreases to subsistence levels, and even the slightest drought becomes extremely dangerous. During the Tsarist and provisional government's times, there were at least some incentives to produce food for the market. It was levied at a suboptimal but still acceptable price. More than that, industrial farms were still there to keep the market afloat. The Reds demolished them, redistributing lands to the poorest peasants to gain their loyalty, and also offered nothing in return for levied grain. So not only were the most productive estates substituted with unproductive personal farms, but even farmers themselves had no reason to produce above their consumption level. The Bolsheviks would just take it away with no compensation, so why bother? On this chart you can see the overall production started to decline even before the Reds took over, but accelerated during their rule. This proves that the bad policy was the prime cause of the disaster. But why was it even enacted? You see, the Bolsheviks always stated that the Great War wasn't Russia's war, the people wanted peace, and so on and so on. Yet as soon as they took power, their forces started rapidly expanding to compensate for a lack of experience and tactics with higher numbers. At their peak, the Reds fielded over 5 million men, while the Whites only 1 million. So about 6 million in total participated in the Civil War, while the peak strength of the entire empire's army in the Great War was about 8 million. So the rate of mobilization from 1917 to 1922 was far higher compared to 1914-1917. The Whites occupied the breadbaskets of the former empire, while the Reds had only the Volga region to support about 60% of the population of the entire country. To rob the peasants of everything above the basic survival threshold was the only viable way to do that. But it was the communists who chose to start the civil war at all, and thus to resort to this policy, so the guilt is also theirs. Also, it's bitterly ironic that the main contributor to the international relief effort organized to ease the suffering from the famine was America, the nation the Soviets considered that arch-nemesis and tried to destroy practically all the time before they destroyed themselves. Earlier I said that the main reason such famines occur is disincentivizing production, so there would be no margin of safety during a bad year. However, the next big Soviet famine breaks even that rule, the 1932 one. also known as Holodomor, was caused mostly by excessive levy rate, not just peasants not working hard enough. After Stalin consolidated his power in 1928, he immediately started forced industrialization of the country. Why was he so insistent on it is a topic for another video. Right now we will discuss its link to the famine. Grain was the main export of both the Russian Empire and the USSR at the time, so he launched a collectivization initiative to bring all of agriculture under state control, effectively reinstating wartime communism, but even harsher and as a long-term solution, to get export revenues and finance foreign machinery purchases. Now the peasant didn't own his land. In fact, he was now a hired worker on a state farm. However, he was paid not in rubles, but in an in-game currency called Trudadin or Labor Day, effectively locking him on a subsistence level. Also, the collective farmers, the Soviet way to say serfs, couldn't leave their kolkhoz or collective farm without permission. Those who weren't happy with it were either killed or deported, so about 4 million competent farmers were forced from their homes and spent the spring of 1931 dying from cold and poor living conditions in captivity and deportation, instead of tilling the land. This new iteration of serfdom allowed the government to start levying grain on levels not seen even during the Civil War. In 1930 and 1931, the Soviets exported about 1/3 of all the grain harvested in the country. When it became apparent that such rates decimated seeds for the future year, the Soviets tried to prepare for the inevitable disaster. But importing food now, or asking for another international relief effort, would have painted Stalinist industrialization as a mistake, and Stalin couldn't afford that. Instead, he hesitated and allowed about 7 million people to die. The level of vice here is just extraordinary. Let's focus on just 2 examples. This is a poster from 1932 mocking the Western nations for their low growth rates compared to the Soviet Union. Let's avoid mentioning the low base effect and the fact that the West was in the Great Depression. Just remember that while Americans were losing their jobs, ordinary Soviets were losing their lives to provide the state with more grain so it could make up for the falling international grain prices with volume and maintain the industrialization rate. The other is even worse. Do you know what was one of the policies the Soviets chose to combat the famine? They opened premium groceries to let people buy the food with foreign currency the government so desperately needed to finance industrialization. Saving people from death by hunger for a pay is a nightmare even the worst anarcho-capitalist wouldn't dare to imagine. In short, while it wasn't the goal of the Soviets to starve to death as many people as possible, they surely did do everything they could to create conditions for it. During the Civil War, it was to win and secure power after they lost the elections. During Stalin's era, it was to avoid admitting mistakes and create a powerful military. However, it has all been in vain, as this military would be destroyed during the first months or even weeks of Operation Barbarossa. In the next section, we will learn why. At the start of the war on the Eastern Front, the Soviets had about 11,000 tanks, 8,000 planes, more than 60,000 artillery pieces and mortars, compared to only 3,500 tanks, 4,000 aircraft and about 40,000 guns on the German side. Not only were the Soviets numerically superior, but their vehicles were also better on average. The Germans fielded about 1,200 early Panzer III at-4s, while the Soviets had 1,500 T-34s and KV-1s, which were a whole generation ahead in protection, mobility and even firepower. They could pierce through the German armor at any reasonable distance, when being invincible themselves. Or so every tank game enthusiast would tell you. What an average War Thunder player doesn't know is that the only thing they lacked was good communication, as radio sets weren't seen as crucial by the Soviet military thought at the time, and this proved to be an important disadvantage later on. All other Soviet machines were roughly on par with the bulk of German armor represented by Panzer Is and IIs, but had a numerical superiority of about 4-1. It's the same story for the aircraft and artillery. On paper, Soviet machines were on par or even superior, but the German crews were far more experienced, which was especially important for aerial combat. While a substantial part of the Red Army Air Force was obliterated on the ground, the rest still outnumbered the Germans but ceded the air superiority anyway. So the Red Army didn't fail in the hardware department, at least not in the quality of the machines it possessed. Where it did fumble was the soft skills, army organization, quality of command, and logistics. And here's where yet another party about the nation moment appears. In 1937, the Great Purge decimated the officer corps. About 80% of officers ranking from division commander and above were either executed or imprisoned. Probably the greatest of them was Mikhail Tukhachevsky, practically Soviet Hungarian who advocated for wider use of mechanized mechanized forces, encouraging initiative for all levels of command, installing radio sets and expanding the signal corps to improve communications and other similar measures. These ideas were initially adopted, but after the killing of Stalin's close ally Kirov in 1934, the dictator's mind swiftly changed, and he began to value loyalty far above competence, especially when the merit called for delegating some power. So reformists like Tukhachevsky were repressed, while Stalin's old friends avoided the purge, even despite being absolute idiots like Budyonny, who possessed some cool mustache but no brain cells, failing in every role he was assigned throughout the war, and advocating for creating cavalry divisions in the era of mechanized warfare. To increase the party's control of the military, a political commissar position was created. Those were people who could overrule professional officers if they disagreed with their actions, even if commissars themselves didn't have a clue about military affairs. In practice, it often led to extra casualties, as professional officers were more cautious, while political commissars tried to achieve prestigious goals regardless of losses. For example, the Southwestern Front's commissar, Nikolai Vashugin, threatened to shoot the commander of the still regrouping 8th Mechanized Corps, Dmitry Ryabyshev, if he didn't counterattack the incoming Germans immediately. Ryabyshev tried to argue, but submitted and started to advance with his corps. They even took the target city of Dubno for a short time, but were encircled and destroyed, leading to the loss of 30,000 men and more than 1,000 tanks, all because a party official thought he knew better. But probably the worst consequence of the purge was cultural. Now commanders were too afraid to take initiative, as any action not approved by the central apparatus would invite repression. That's why when the invasion began, most Soviet officers did absolutely nothing. After all, Stalin didn't order them anything, so a safe bet would be to just chill and await orders. Stalin was also in disbelief and didn't issue the first order to resist until 3 hours after Barbarossa started. By that time, most of the communication hubs near the front line were already taken out by bombardment or by sabotage, so the majority of local officers were still doing nothing. This allowed the Germans to advance unimpeded and take advantageous positions before the Soviets went full get into counterattack mode, so the Red Army's attempts to win possessions back were easily repelled. The decision to surround the party with yes-men also backfired in logistics. The state was focused on producing the hardware itself, not spare parts and ammunition for it. Although the Soviets were somewhat aware of that, the actual scale of the problem wasn't known, because reporting the lack of something was quite risky. What if the wise leader will think it was you who stole the parts and not mechanical plant XXX who failed to supply them? The constant fear of honest feedback was reinforced by never-ending purges. They continued even through 1940 and 1941, where logistics were hit especially hard. The deputy head of the Artillery and Missile Department, or GRAU in Russian, Georgy Savchenko, was executed in 1941, and Minister of Armaments Boris Vannikov was arrested just 2 weeks before the German attack. This constant reshuffling and lack of proper feedback led to the situation where the Union had plenty of tanks, but no spare parts to keep them running. That's why you see so many photos of abandoned Soviet vehicles during the early months of the war in the East. The communists sacrificed millions of their people to industrialize fast and produce as much military equipment as possible, just to lose it all because of their own paranoia and lust for power. The saddest part, however, is that it was ordinary people of the Union who paid for the party's mistakes with their lives. The consensus estimates of the USSR's losses are about 27 million people, about 13% of the country's population. Most of them were civilians, murdered or starved because of Nazi occupation. But there is no doubt that the occupation itself was the direct consequence of the Red Army's collapse in the early months of the war. The Germans couldn't have advanced as far and put as many people to misery as they did if the Soviet army was led by competent commanders not afraid of the proper feedback. These were the main instances where the communists deliberately placed their interests above those of the people they ruled. They preferred to put the nation on fire rather than admit defeat in democratic elections. They didn't prevent the famines to win in the civil war and complete industrialization at all costs, just to nullify such sacrifices by losing most of the military built on people's ruined lives in the first months of the Operation Barbarossa. Russians and other nations of the Union paid a high price to correct these mistakes, but they never got the reward for it. In the next video of the series, we'll talk about how communists failed even when they acted with good faith, simply because you can't build a prosperous nation on Marxist economics. If you learned something new from this video and want to know even more, hit the almighty like and subscribe buttons, and if you enjoyed the style, consider watching my other videos discussing wider economic history. And as always, thank you for watching.
На рубаре мой порядковый номер.